Isabella Parker had always been seen as the golden child of the Parker family, admired for her beauty and intelligence, but behind closed doors, she was hiding a dangerous secret. Charles and Margaret Parker, her devoted parents who had sacrificed everything for her, never imagined that the daughter they cherished was plotting their downfall. Daniel Carter, Isabella's charming boyfriend, appeared to be the perfect partner, but his influence pushed her into a world of manipulation, greed, and betrayal. What began as a simple dream of freedom and luxury soon spiraled into a chilling plan that would end in one of the most shocking family murders the town had ever witnessed. Isabella Lopez was always seen as the quiet girl next door, the one who rarely caused any trouble and seemed to have her life in order. To the outside world, her family appeared close and supportive. Miguel Lopez, her father, worked long hours at a shipping company and was known for his strict but caring nature. Teresa Lopez, her mother, was devoted to her home and family, often volunteering in the community and keeping their modest suburban house warm and inviting. Behind the walls of that house, however, cracks had begun to show. Isabella, now in her early 20s, was growing restless. She felt trapped under her parents' watchful eyes, constantly reminded of responsibility, tradition, and the expectation to follow a straight path. What no one knew was that Isabella had started a secret relationship with Daniel Cruz, a young man her parents would have disapproved of. Daniel was charming but reckless, with no stable job and a reputation for drifting in and out of trouble. To Isabella, however, he represented freedom and excitement, a break from the suffocating routine of her home life. Daniel often talked about escaping together, traveling, and living a life where no one could control them. His dreams resonated with Isabella, who longed for something more than the life her parents had mapped out for her. But the dreams came with a price. Daniel didn't have the money to make them real. Late-night conversations turned into frustration, and frustration into desperate planning. The idea of finding fast money took root, and soon Daniel began pressuring Isabella to think of a solution. She was torn between loyalty to her family and her burning desire to escape with him. At first, she resisted. Yet the more Daniel painted the picture of a lavish trip, together sun-soaked beaches, expensive hotels, and freedom from Judgment Tha, more the thought consumed her. Isabella began to resent her parents for standing in the way of what she wanted. Every argument about responsibility, every reminder about rules, and every restriction her parents set felt heavier than before. In her mind, Miguel and Teresa became obstacles rather than protectors. That resentment was fueled by Daniel's constant words that they could have it all if she just found the courage to take what was theirs. Slowly, her thoughts shifted from guilt to justification. It started with little lies to cover her relationship, then small thefts of money from her mother's purse. But it wasn't enough. The couple began to fantasize about something bigger. Daniel spoke openly about what could be done, and although the words seemed too dark to be real, Isabella didn't stop him. In her heart, she knew she was crossing into dangerous territory. Still, the desire for freedom and the promise of adventure clouded her judgment. By the time the idea of violence surfaced, Isabella was no longer shocked. Instead, she found herself imagining what life might look like if she didn't have her parents in the way. The thought terrified her, but it also exhilarated her. What began as a forbidden romance was now spiraling into a plan that would change everything. A plan born from desperation, secrecy, and a dangerous kind of love. Isabella's relationship with Daniel deepened in the shadows, hidden from her parents' watchful eyes. She began sneaking out late at night, lying about study groups or shifts at work that didn't exist. Each secret meeting brought them closer, but it also pulled her further away from her family. Daniel had a magnetic way of making her believe he was the only one who truly understood her. The only person who saw the dullness of her life at home and offered her something brighter. Their conversations always circled back to money and how their dream life was just out of reach. Daniel spoke of luxury and freedom, of traveling across Europe, staying in resorts, and never worrying about bills. Isabella clung to those images like they were her lifeline. At home, the tension grew. Miguel noticed her distracted behavior, the way her eyes lingered on her phone and how she disappeared for hours without explanation. Teresa worried about the secrecy and confronted her daughter, but Isabella responded with anger, accusing her mother of being controlling. The once warm and open household became colder, filled with suspicion and arguments. Isabella, instead of feeling guilt, grew more convinced that her parents were barriers holding her back from the happiness she deserved. The real turning point came one evening when Daniel, frustrated with their lack of money, began speaking more seriously about getting rid of her parents. His tone was calm, as though he were discussing something ordinary. He told Isabella that her parents had money saved. Money they didn't need, money that could fund their escape. At first, Isabella recoiled, horrified by the suggestion, but Daniel persisted, weaving his words carefully. He reminded her of every time Miguel had shouted at her, every time Teresa had made her feel small. He told her that without them, she would be free, and together they could start a life without chains. The thought haunted Isabella. She lay awake at night, imagining both possibilities. Staying under her parents' control, or breaking free in a way that felt final and irreversible. Fear battled with temptation, but the more she replayed Daniel's words, the more she felt herself leaning toward the unthinkable. When she looked at her parents now, she no longer saw love and protection. She saw obstacles and limitations. Her resentment, carefully nurtured by Daniel's influence, began to poison every memory she had of them. Her parents remained unaware of the depth of Isabella's struggles. Miguel continued to enforce strict rules, believing discipline would set his daughter straight. Teresa tried to reach her with affection, unaware that Isabella's heart was already turning cold. Every gesture from them only fueled Isabella's growing justification. She told herself that they would never let her live the life she wanted, and that Daniel was her only chance at happiness. By the time Isabella finally whispered her agreement to Daniel, it no longer felt like a question of morality, but a twisted form of necessity. She convinced herself that it was the only way forward, the only path to freedom. The plan was no longer just a conversation, it was becoming a reality. Once Isabella crossed the line in her mind, there was no turning back. She and Daniel began meeting more often in secluded places, whispering about the details of what they were about to do. At first, their conversations were vague, broad ideas about timing and what would come after, but gradually, they sharpened into something far darker and more specific. Daniel's influence was unmistakable. He painted the plan as simple and foolproof, convincing Isabella that it was the only way to make their dream life a reality. He reassured her that once it was done, she would never have to live under her parents' roof again, never hear their criticisms, never feel trapped. They discussed methods, timing, and alibis. Daniel insisted that the crime had to happen quickly, without hesitation. He told her that hesitation was dangerous, that once the first step was taken, the rest would fall into place. Isabella's stomach churned every time she thought about it, but the promises of a glamorous future always drowned out her doubts. She began to view her parents' routines with new eyes, watching when Miguel left for work, when Teresa cooked in the kitchen, when they were most vulnerable. Her mind, once filled with ordinary thoughts, now became a notebook of opportunities and weaknesses. The idea of money was central to everything. Daniel pressed her about where her parents kept their savings, if there were safes or hidden accounts, anything they could access after the act. Isabella reluctantly revealed that Miguel had spoken about life insurance policies and small investments, things she barely understood. To Daniel, it was enough. He assured her that even if it wasn't a fortune, it would be a start, and from there, they could build the life they imagined. His confidence gave Isabella a sense of inevitability, as though she were caught in a current too strong to escape. At home, Isabella grew colder. She avoided her parents, her responses short and dismissive. Miguel interpreted it as teenage rebellion, while Teresa's heart ached, unable to reach the daughter she once held so close. They had no idea that each argument, each stern look, was being twisted in Isabella's mind into further justification. She told herself they had pushed her to this point, that they had left her no choice but to take such drastic measures. When the final conversation happened, it was chilling in its simplicity. Daniel laid out the plan. One night, when Miguel and Teresa were both at home, Isabella would make sure the doors were unlocked and distractions were in place. Daniel would bring what they needed. He assured her it would be quick, that she wouldn't have to do everything herself, but she had to be ready. Isabella agreed with a trembling nod, her voice barely audible. In that moment, the plan solidified into reality. The days leading up to the crime felt surreal. Isabella drifted through her home like a stranger, memorizing the walls, the smell of her mother's cooking, the sound of her father's heavy footsteps. All while knowing what she and Daniel were planning. Fear lingered, but it was tangled with anticipation, and the thought of finally being free made her push the fear away. The night of the crime arrived, cloaked in a deceptive calm. Miguel had spent the evening reading in the living room, while Teresa busied herself in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared a simple meal. Isabella watched them both with a mix of dread and detachment. Her heart racing, yet her face betrayed nothing. Every sound seemed louder than usual. The clatter of a spoon against a pot, the rustle of pages being turned, the ticking of the clock on the wall. Time felt both agonizingly slow and unbearably fast, as though the world itself knew something unspeakable was about to happen. Daniel had already messaged her, reminding her to leave the back door unlocked. His words were confident, almost casual, but Isabella's hands trembled as she followed through. She checked the lock once, twice, and finally left it open, her pulse pounding in her ears. She glanced at her parents one last time before retreating upstairs, telling herself she couldn't think of them as her mother and father anymore. They were simply obstacles, standing in the way of everything she thought she deserved. The silence of the house was broken when the back door creaked open. Isabella froze, every muscle tightening. She knew it was Daniel. She forced herself to stay calm as he slipped inside, his presence bringing with it an icy chill. He moved with purpose, carrying what he needed, his face hardened by determination. There was no hesitation in him, no flicker of doubt. That certainty unnerved Isabella more than anything else, but it also made her feel trapped. She had gone too far to stop it now. Daniel gestured for her to stay put, and for a moment she thought he would do it all without her. But then he whispered for her to be ready. The weight of those words pressed on her chest like a stone. Together, they crept through the dimly lit house, each step deliberate, every sound magnified. Teresa's voice carried faintly from the kitchen, her soft humming now a haunting soundtrack to what was about to unfold. The moment it began, it was sudden and violent. Daniel struck first, his movements swift and merciless. Teresa's startled cry was cut short, echoing through the walls like a warning too late to be heard. Miguel leaped up from his chair, confusion written across his face. But before he could react fully, the chaos consumed him. Isabella stood frozen at first, her body refusing to move as her parents struggled, their voices a mix of pain and disbelief. Then Daniel's sharp glance pulled her into the horror, forcing her to act. With trembling hands, she participated, her fear mixing with adrenaline, until she could no longer tell one from the other. The house, once warm and familiar, became a nightmare of shadows and sounds. Every detail etched itself into her mind, the overturned chair, the sharp metallic scent in the air, the silence that followed when it was over. Isabella's chest heaved as she stared at what they had done, her heart hammering so violently she thought it might burst. Daniel, however, was calm. He wiped his hands, his face set in cold resolve, as though this were nothing more than a step in their plan. He whispered that it was finished, that there was no turning back. Isabella nodded numbly, her mind spinning, her body trembling uncontrollably. The dream of freedom and escape that once seemed intoxicating now felt distant and hollow. The reality of what she had agreed to, what she had done, settled over her like a suffocating weight. Yet Daniel's hand on her shoulder pulled her forward, insisting they had to move quickly. There was no time for grief, no room for hesitation. The night was only beginning, and the true test of their choices still lay ahead. The aftermath of the crime was chaos disguised as silence. The house, which had moments earlier been filled with warmth and the ordinary sounds of a family evening, now felt like a tomb. Isabella's heart raced as she stood in the dimly lit living room, staring at the lifeless forms of her parents. The reality of what she and Daniel had done pressed down on her like a crushing weight, but Daniel's sharp, steady voice cut through her haze. He reminded her that panic would ruin everything. They had a plan, and now they needed to follow it. Daniel moved swiftly, already preparing for the cleanup as though he had rehearsed every step. He dragged Miguel's body away from the chair and began gathering what he needed to remove traces of the struggle. Isabella forced herself to join in, her hands trembling as she picked up scattered items, wiping down surfaces with shaking movements. Every stain she tried to erase seemed to spread in her mind, reminding her of the permanence of what had happened. No matter how much they cleaned, the truth was written into the walls of her memory. The smell of blood clung to the air, sharp and metallic, making her stomach churn. She gagged once, but Daniel silenced her quickly, his eyes hard and unyielding. He told her she had to hold herself together. They could not leave anything behind. Together, they dragged Teresa's body closer to McGee, both of them grunting under the weight, their breaths quick and shallow. The sounds of effort felt deafening in the silence of the house, every scrape against the floor echoing like an accusation. Daniel laid out plastic sheets he had brought with him, wrapping the bodies carefully with a precision that horrified Isabella. It was as though he had planned for this possibility long before she had even agreed to go through with it. She wondered, fleetingly, if Daniel had always been waiting for someone like her to cross that line, to make his dark ideas a reality. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, but she shoved it aside. There was no space for doubt now. As they worked, Isabella couldn't stop thinking of the details that felt too human to erase. Her father's reading glasses still lay on the floor where they had fallen. Her mother's apron was stained, not just with what had just happened, but also with remnants of the dinner she had been preparing. These small things pierced Isabella's numbness, reminding her that her parents had been alive and ordinary only moments before. She picked up the glasses with trembling hands, wanting to keep them, but Daniel snatched them away, tossing them into a bag meant for evidence they needed to destroy. They scrubbed the floor, wiping away what they could, but Isabella felt certain that no matter how much they cleaned, the house itself knew the truth. Every creak of the wood, every shadow seemed to whisper of betrayal and violence. She tried to steady herself by focusing on Daniel's instructions, but her thoughts kept drifting to what would come next. Where would they take the bodies? How could they ensure no one would discover the truth? And above all, could she live with herself after this night? When the work was finally done, the house looked eerily normal. The kitchen was tidy, the living room in order, the surfaces wiped clean. But Isabella knew it was all a fragile illusion. Beneath the veneer of calm, the house was soaked in guilt. Daniel looked at her then, his expression unreadable, and told her they were almost finished. The hardest part, he promised, was over. Yet Isabella felt the opposite. For her, the hardest part was only beginning. The bodies were wrapped and ready to be moved, and with every passing second, the weight of what they had to do next pressed down heavier, threatening to crush her entirely. The night was colder than Isabella expected as she and Daniel carried the heavy, wrapped bundles to the trunk of Daniel's car. The weight was not only physical but emotional, pressing into her with every step. Her arms shook from exhaustion, and her mind buzzed with the horror of what they were doing. The once familiar streets of a neighborhood seemed foreign under the pale glow of streetlights, as if the world itself had turned against her. Every passing shadow felt like an accusation, every distant noise like a threat of discovery. Daniel, however, remained calm and focused. His movements were mechanical, almost rehearsed, as though he had been preparing for this moment for years. He instructed Isabella to hold the trunk open as he hoisted the first bundle inside. She flinched when the sound of the body thudded against the metal, her stomach turning violently, but Daniel barely noticed. He repeated the task with the second body, and then he covered both with blankets. Tools, and old boxers, making the trunk appear like nothing more than clutter. They drove in silence, the hum of the engine the only sound filling the car. Isabella stared out of the window, her reflection pale and hollow in the glass. She thought of her mother's laughter, of her father's patience, of the way the house used to feel safe and alive. Now, all of it was gone, replaced by a suffocating emptiness. She wondered if she could ever go back, if there was any way to undo what had been done. But the sight of Daniel's steady hands gripping the steering wheel told her that their path was irreversible. Daniel chose the back roads, winding through stretches of forest and desolate fields. The darkness outside grew thicker, and the isolation gnawed at Isabella. She clutched her hands together in her lap, trying to keep them from shaking. Every so often, she imagined flashing lights behind them, imagined police cars closing in, imagined herself being dragged out of the car in handcuffs. But the night remained quiet, almost mocking in its indifference. When Daniel finally pulled off onto a dirt path deep in the woods, Isabella's heart nearly stopped. The trees loomed overhead like watchful sentinels, their branches whispering in the wind. The car came to a halt, and Daniel told her it was time. Together, they dragged the bodies from the trunk, the sound of plastic crinkling unnerving in the silence. The ground was uneven, the dirt damp, and each step felt like trudging deeper into a nightmare. Daniel had brought shovels. He handed one to Isabella, and she froze, staring at it as though it were some alien object. Digging a hole for her parents felt unthinkable, but Daniel's sharp look left her no choice. She thrust the shovel into the ground, her muscles screaming from fatigue, the earth resisting her efforts. With each scoop of dirt, the reality of what they were doing pressed harder against her mind. The work was brutal, the hole deep and wide enough to hide what they had done. Isabella's hands blistered, her body trembling, but Daniel never faltered. He kept digging with a cold determination that frightened her more than the act itself. When the graves were ready, they lowered the bundles in, Isabella biting her lips so hard she tasted blood. Her vision blurred as tears welled, but Daniel warned her not to break down. Weakness would only make things worse. They covered the bodies with dirt, layer by layer, until the ground looked almost untouched. But to Isabella, the earth itself seemed scarred, heavy with secrets. She felt as though the forest would never forget, that the trees and soil would always carry the memory of her betrayal. As they packed the shovels back into the car, her body ached with exhaustion, but her mind was restless. She knew this was not the end. Disposing of the bodies might hide the evidence for now, but the guilt was something she could never bury. As they drove away, the forest swallowed the graves behind them. Isabella stared back into the darkness until it vanished, her chest hollow and cold. Daniel reached over and squeezed her hand briefly, a gesture meant to reassure, but it only deepened her dread. He believed they were safe now, that they had silenced the past. Isabella, however, knew that what they had done would haunt her forever. The secret they had buried that night was alive, and she feared it would eventually claw its way back to the surface. The disappearance of Margaret and Charles did not go unnoticed. Neighbors began to whisper within days, puzzled by the sudden quiet around the once lively home. Margaret had been a familiar face at church, always involved in community events, while Charles was known for his steady presence at the local hardware store. Their absence was loud and strange, and the story spread quickly, raising suspicions that something terrible had happened. People began asking Isabella questions, but she offered vague explanations, claiming her parents had taken an unexpected trip. The lie came easily from her lips, but it did not sit well with those who knew the couple. Detectives were assigned to the case after a missing persons report was filed. They began interviewing friends, co-workers, and relatives, piecing together a timeline of the parents' last known activities. Isabella tried to remain calm during her questioning, but her nervous energy betrayed her. She insisted that her parents had been talking about traveling, though she couldn't produce any evidence to support the claim. Daniel, when questioned separately, repeated the same story, but his delivery was more controlled, as though he had prepared for it. Even so, the detectives noticed the inconsistencies between their answers. As investigators dug deeper, small red flags began to emerge. Credit cards belonging to Margaret and Charles showed no activity after the supposed trip, and their phones had been switched off abruptly. Their car, too, was still parked in the driveway, untouched. These details painted a troubling picture, one that didn't align with Isabella's story. Detectives quietly began to suspect foul play. They also noted how detached Isabella seemed when discussing her parents' disappearance, her tone cold where grief would have been expected. The house itself became a focus. Forensic teams were eventually sent in, and while the rooms looked orderly, there were faint traces that told a different story. Carpets had been cleaned recently, though no one could recall Isabella ever being so meticulous. Subtle stains in the flooring hinted at something more sinister, and though they weren't conclusive, they raised eyebrows among investigators. It was enough to keep the pressure on Isabella and Daniel, whose alibis seemed thinner with every new discovery. Meanwhile, the community turned against them. Neighbors who once greeted Isabella with warmth now kept their distance, suspicious of her behavior. Rumors circulated about her relationship with Daniel, how controlling he seemed, and how quickly she had grown distant from her family after meeting him. Some claimed they had overheard arguments between Isabella and her parents. while others whispered about the large sums of money Isabella had recently been asking about. The weight of these suspicions added to the growing case against them. Isabella tried to maintain her composure, but cracks began to show. She was haunted by the secret buried in the woods, replaying the night in her mind with suffocating guilt. Sleep became impossible, and her nerves frayed under constant surveillance. Daniel, on the other hand, remained steady, urging her to stay strong and reminding her that fear would only expose them. Yet even his composure began to slip, as detectives made repeated visits, each time with sharper questions. The turning point came when dogs were brought in to search the surrounding woods. Authorities had no clear evidence yet, but the inconsistencies in Isabella's story had given them reason to widen their search. Watching from a window as search teams fanned out across the countryside, Isabella felt her chest tightened with dread. Every bark from the dogs echoed in her ears, like a countdown to the inevitable. She knew the secret they had buried would not stay hidden much longer, and the fragile facade she and Daniel had built was starting to crumble. The search intensified as investigators grew more suspicious of Isabella and Daniel. What had started as a routine missing persons case was now turning into a criminal investigation, fueled by the unease that hung over the community and the mounting inconsistencies in the couple's story. The wooded area behind the family home became the focal point. A stretch of land that Isabella and Daniel had once thought would keep their secret safe. But no secret stayed buried forever. Cadaver dogs were brought in, their handlers carefully guiding them through the dense undergrowth. It didn't take long before the animals began to signal, their urgent behavior drawing the attention of the entire team. The ground was disturbed, the soil uneven, in a way that stood out to the trained eyes of investigators. With quiet efficiency, the team marked the area and began to dig. The first layer of earth gave way to the unmistakable sight of fabric, then flesh. Within moments, the horrifying truth emerged. The bodies of Margaret and Charles, carefully concealed but crudely buried, were uncovered. The crime scene was sealed off immediately, and word spread through the town like wildfire. What had been whispers of suspicion turned into an eruption of shock and outrage. The loving couple everyone admired had been brutally taken from the world by the very daughter they had raised. Isabella was arrested that same evening! Detectives arrived at the house with warrants in hand, their faces grim with the weight of what they had just discovered. Daniel was taken into custody as well, his calm demeanor cracking for the first time as handcuffs snapped around his wrists. Neighbors watched from across the street, horrified and vindicated all at once, as the young couple was led away. Some wept openly for the loss of Margaret and Charles, while others shook their heads in disbelief at the betrayal. Interrogations began immediately. Under the pressure of evidence, Isabella's composure disintegrated. She tried to cling to her story at first, but the weight of the discovery in the woods made her lies impossible to maintain. Her voice trembled, her excuses fell apart, and soon she was left in silence, staring at the table in front of her. Daniel, in contrast, attempted to control the narrative, insisting they had been forced into a terrible situation, shifting blame onto Isabella whenever he could. But investigators had already pieced together the roles each had played, and the attempt to distance himself only made him appear colder and more manipulative. The courtroom months later was packed, the atmosphere tense as details of the crime unfolded. The prosecution painted a vivid picture of greed and obsession. A daughter so consumed by the desire for a life with her boyfriend that she was willing to destroy her family. Photographs of the burial site and forensic evidence left the jury shaken. Isabella sat with her head down, pale and hollow-eyed, while Daniel kept his gaze fixed forward, unrepentant to the very end. When the verdict was finally read, the silence in the room was suffocating. Both were found guilty of murder, sentenced to life without parole. The judge's words cut through the stillness, condemning their actions as a betrayal of the deepest bond of trust. The community, though heartbroken, felt a measure of justice had been delivered. Yet for many, the wounds remained raw, the image of the loving parents forever overshadowed by the brutality of their deaths. For Isabella, the dream of escape and freedom had turned into a nightmare of bars and chains. For Daniel, the promises of love and loyalty had ended in nothing but ruin. And for the town, the tragedy became a lasting reminder of how darkness can hide behind even the most familiar smiles.